Change.
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 Change can start with me.
With me.
With me.
With me.
But together,
We can support.
We can rebuild.
We can transform.
we can encourage,
We can lift up.
We can move forward.
We can make progress.
because we
Because we
Because
Because
we is greater than me.
Welcome to Real Church for Real People, everybody. And to all of you gathering online with us right now, so glad that you are along for the ride. Newark, will you help me show some love to everybody online right now? Love you guys. So glad to be with you this final weekend of August and this final weekend of the series that we've been in called We is Greater Than Me. It's been an amazing, amazing weekend so far, and it's been an amazing month. We have been all month long serving during Love Month, rolling up our sleeves and making a difference in the lives of people who are near us and need us. It's been our week of prayer. This week, Monday through Friday, we connected every evening for prayer at both of our physical locations, Newark and West Wilmington, and then also online at yourjourney.tv. And just an amazing week. And as part of the finale of that, so if you're new to our church, Week of Prayer is something we do every August to kind of get ready for back to school and fall. And of course, that looks very different for a lot of us this year. So I think we need it more than ever. And if you missed Week of Prayer, not to worry, you do have one more opportunity to be a part of it, and that's tonight. This evening, we are wrapping this up with a night of worship. We're going to experience God together here at our Newark location at 7 p.m. this evening. So I want to encourage you to join us for that. It's going to be very, very powerful. And we had such a powerful time of worship just a few minutes ago. We're kind of going to extend that a little bit tonight. And it's going to be a meaningful way to enter into this fall season. And as we wrap up the series, jump into the final message, if you've been tracking this month, we have been discovering that together we can do more, that when we align our lives with a few people going the same direction, it's amazing what we can accomplish and how we can be shaped more into the kinds of people that we probably deep down desire to become. And if you missed any of the messages during the series, you can go back and watch those on our website or on our YouTube channel. But as we wrap up the series, there's one more piece of the puzzle that's important in all of this, and it has to do with our friendships and why they matter so much. And I've shared this, if you've been coming to the journey any length of time, you've heard me talk about this before, but I am an introvert by nature. So that does not mean that I don't like people, common misconception. I do like people. I just recharge best by being alone. How many of us, that's your story, just you recharge best by being alone? Watching online right now, hopefully you're alone. You're recharging right now, you know. If you're not, you're like, I'm gonna find some time later. This is good, I have people, but later I will be alone. So if you're an introvert, you understand it is not that we don't like people, it's just that we can't handle all people all the time. Anybody know what I'm talking about? We need the people to come, and then we need the people to go. Introverts, right? You know what I'm saying. And I really first realized how much of an introvert I am many years ago when I was with a group of friends in one of their apartments. We were watching the movie Castaway together. If you haven't seen Castaway, Tom Hanks plays a guy whose plane crashes and he washes up on a deserted island all alone, and he's stranded there for a long time, long enough to form a meaningful connection with a volleyball. Wilson, if you haven't seen it, you owe it to yourself. And he's trapped there on this deserted island all alone, has to fend for himself, find food, find shelter, all of that. And in the middle of the movie, I turned to my friends and I said, wouldn't that be amazing? Like, wouldn't that be awesome to have a whole island all to yourself and nobody to bother you? And all my friends looked at me like I was crazy. They were all extroverts. They just didn't understand. Yeah, us introverts, we like a good island. Every once in a while, just me and a volleyball. It just, And I've realized as I kind of pay attention to my own life over time that in my mind, I could survive long periods of time without other people. In my mind, doesn't mean I literally could, but in my mind, it's easy for me to just spend time by myself and recharge by being alone. Now, some of you can't relate at all. You're extroverts. If you were on a deserted island, you would die of boredom in 17 minutes. You'd be like, where are the people? I can't handle it. You need people around you all the time. You like to be where the action is. And all of us are wired a little bit differently, but here's what I'm learning and what I've seen over many years now of, again, watching my own life, helping so many other people with different personalities take steps in a spiritual journey. I'm learning that all of us, regardless of our introvert or extrovert wiring, we play out that scene on a regular basis. We crash our own planes into the oceans of our own issues, and we end up stranded on our own islands, and we kind of isolate ourselves from the people around us. Now, we may do that in obvious ways if we're introverts. Maybe even during this season, if we were honest, we've been using the pandemic as an excuse for probably more seclusion than we actually need. I'm sorry I can't be there, there's a pandemic. I'm sorry I can't talk, there's a pandemic. I'm sorry, Mom, I know it's been 3 months but there's a pandemic. We're kind of using this season as like, I'm alone. I've been tempted to do that. Oh, I like being in my house and everything's kind of the way that I want it. I'm comfortable here. I'm alone. Others of us, it's not so obvious. We're surrounded by people on a regular basis. We're very outgoing. We're very extroverted. But the reality is, if we were honest, a lot of our friendships are shallow. There's not a lot of depth to them. There's a lot of noise, but not a lot of meaning. And if we're honest, we might as well be on an island, because when the chips are down, we are trying to do life, the stuff that matters, our relationships, our finances, our spiritual and emotional health. We're trying to do that basically alone. So here's the question for all of us. The big question: how much do we really need other people? Not in a codependent way, like I need you, you complete me. I'm not talking about that. But how much do we need people in an interdependent way? Like, I need you because together we can do more. And to tackle that question, I want us, as we wrap up the series, to look at a book in the New Testament of the Bible called Hebrews. Now, Hebrews is an interesting book because it's written to a group of people, Jewish people, who had put their faith in Jesus. And it's written to them during a season when they are experiencing extreme uncertainty. They're facing persecution because of their beliefs. They're dealing with an economic downturn that is disproportionately affecting them in the world that they're living in. Because of their ethnicity and where they are, they're dealing with extreme financial hardship and pressure. They're in the midst of political upheaval. It's a time when the rulers of Rome have become drunk on their own egos, and they're making life miserable for anybody who doesn't agree with them. It's an extremely unpredictable time. And on top of all of that, the people the book of Hebrews is written to are trying to figure out what it really means to follow Jesus, because they're still used to the Jewish religion, the Old Testament, how they did life before Jesus came. And they're very familiar with all of the old ways of knowing God. And the temple was the center of their faith. And they were used to bringing sacrifices to worship God and keeping all of these laws and regulations and following all of these rituals. And now all of a sudden, Jesus has come and changed all of this. And I want you to listen closely as I read some verses from the book of Hebrews. If you're not Jewish, or if you're new to the Bible and new to the story and the life of Jesus and what he came to do, these verses might not make sense at first, but they're so important. So lean in and listen to these words. And so, dear brothers and sisters, so the writer of Hebrews writes to these Jewish people who put their faith in Jesus, this little community of believers, and he says, you can boldly enter heaven's most holy place because of the blood of Jesus. What does that mean? Well, again, in the Jewish faith, the temple was the center of their religious system. And the temple was very holy. You could come stand outside the temple, but the ordinary person couldn't go inside the temple. Only priests could go inside the temple. Not only that, but in the center of the temple, there was one little room called the most holy place. that only the high priest, only one person could go into that room, and only once a year. They would come in bringing the blood of an animal sacrifice as a symbol of humanity's sin and the need for God's forgiveness once a year. So a lot of you, whether you realize it or not, can relate to this, because the idea was you can't go straight to God. You need a priest to go to God for you. And you tell the priest what you need, and hopefully the priest doesn't lose anything in translation. But you can't get to God. You, me, we can't get to God. That was the idea. Think of a room that maybe when you were a kid, your parents were like, don't go in there. That's like the most holy place. But the problem is that's where God's presence was. Well, now the writer of Hebrews says, you can go in. Like the door's wide open to the most holy place. It's not a room anymore. It's the presence of God because of what Jesus has done for you. His blood was shed for you to forgive your sins. And by his death, Jesus opened a new and life-giving way through the curtain. So there was this heavy curtain that separated the most holy place. Now it's been swept aside. In fact, when Jesus died, it was torn in two from the top to the bottom. And now you can go into the most holy place. And since we have a great high priest who rules over God's house, that's Jesus, let us go right into the presence of God. Walk right in. No jumping through hoops, no trying to be religious enough, no cleaning up your act first. Just walk right into the presence of God with sincere hearts, fully trusting him. For our guilty consciences. Now let me pause there. How many of us have ever experienced a guilty conscience? Just by a show of hands, gathering online, give me a hands up emoji, guilty conscience. If you haven't, you are a sociopath. So all of us, so I hope your hand went. All of us, in other words, you could be an atheist. You've experienced a guilty conscience. All of us have. There's something inside all of us as human beings that has felt the pain of realizing I don't measure up. I don't even measure up to my own standards sometimes. And if there's a God out there, there's no way I measure up to his standard. So we have these guilty consciences. What are we going to do? Well, the good news is they've been sprinkled with Christ's blood to make us clean. That may sound weird to you, but what that means is when Jesus died on a cross, that cross became the most holy place, and he gave his blood. He came before the Father, God, as our high priest, gave his blood to cover our sins, and now our guilty consciences have been cleansed. We can come before God with no guilt because of what Jesus has done. This is good news. It's good news. And not only that, but our bodies have been washed with pure water, which is a reference to the step of baptism. So we put our faith in Jesus. We were inwardly washed and cleansed. And then we went public with our faith in baptism, which is an outward sign of an inward transformation. Now we have this relationship with God. Now, why is all of that important? Here's why. Because that's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. It means that you have put 100% of your trust and your confidence, not in your own efforts, but in what Jesus has done for you. Not 99% of your confidence. Sometimes people might be like, well, I like a little Jesus, but I got a backup plan. No, you become a follower of Jesus when you say, I'm gonna stop trusting in myself and in other people and in my accomplishments and in my good deeds. I'm gonna trust exclusively and completely in Jesus. He makes me right with God. He washes my guilty conscience. He gives me purpose in life. And then once you do that, you realize that now you can come right into God's presence. No hoops to jump through, no good deeds you need to do in advance, no probation period, no runway or on-ramp. You can walk into God's presence and say, hey, it's me, God. I believe in your Son, so I know you accept me and welcome me based on what Jesus did. That's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So, if you've been saying no to following Jesus, that's what you've been saying no to. And I just want you to understand that. I'm not here to twist your arm, But if you've not yet put your trust in Jesus, you haven't been saying no to joining a religion or just becoming a Christian, a certain label, or living a better life. You've been saying no to a life-giving friendship with God in which, through no effort or work of your own, but purely through the free gift of grace through God's Son, Jesus, you are accepted, you are forgiven, you are made clean, and you now have 24/7 access to El Presidente, the CEO of the universe. So by all means, say no to a distorted view of that, or to just religion, or just to another way of trying to be a good person. But maybe it's time to say yes to trusting Jesus, because only he can bring you into right relationship with the God who created the universe and created you, and then give you constant access to that God, which, can we just pause for a moment and say how amazing it is that we get to know God that way? We can go right into his presence. And once we get that, once we understand we've been made right with God because of what Jesus has done, we have 24/7 access to the presence of God. Once we get that, something else becomes important. And this goes back to our big question. Right at the beginning of those verses we read these 4 words: dear brothers and sisters. In other words, what Jesus has done has not only connected us to God, our Father, who loves us, but what Jesus has done is connected us to each other. What does that mean? It means there are 2 main things that God has for us, 2 gifts that God wants to give us on a regular basis that will give us the power to flourish this fall and beyond. Because remember, this is written to people who are experiencing uncertainty and political upheaval and an unpredictable economy, an unpredictable climate in which their health was at risk and their lives were at risk, and there was so much going on around them. Sound familiar? And God says, I want to give you 2 gifts. I need you to understand they're the 2 main gifts I have for you. The first one is, God says, my first gift to you is my presence. The presence of God is a gift to everyone who believes in Jesus. And you don't have to wait until you're spiritually mature. You don't have to wait until you've been there's no probation period. Got my 5-year pin today, now I can come into God's presence? No. When you trust Jesus, you can go right into God's presence. I think one of the greatest tragedies there is how many times I think you could probably identify, I don't really pay attention to the access I have to God. I don't really recognize, man, I can come walking into his, anytime I want, I can be in his presence. And I'm not talking just about feeling and emotion. I can know with confidence I'm right there in the most holy place with God. I'm safe, I'm secure. I can come to him at any time I want. How ridiculous would it be if your best friend was the king of the world, the CEO of everything, and you never texted him? Never took him up. If he promised to be there when you needed him and you never took him up on it. And I think many of us miss this opportunity. That's what Week of Prayer has been about all this week, by the way. And just so you know, we did not ask God if it would be okay if we came into his presence during Week of Prayer. He already said it was, so we just walked right in. We just walked right in to the presence of God. And I just want you to know that when you believe in Jesus, whether that happened 5 minutes ago, 5 weeks ago, 5 years ago, 5 decades ago, when you believe in Jesus, you have 24/7 access to the presence of God. So take advantage of it. Take advantage of it. You don't even have to check in with the receptionist. You can go right into his presence anytime you want. That's the first gift God has for you. And the second gift God has for us is the presence of each other. The people who become our brothers and sisters because they've also put their faith in Jesus. And so we know that because of Jesus' blood, we're made right with God. Our guilty conscience is cleansed. We don't have to carry that weight around anymore. You say, well, the guilt thing is kind of important, right? Like it motivates me to clean up my act. You got to decide whether you're going to live your life to get good to get God or to get God to get good. What motivates me to clean up my act is when I come into the presence of a good God and old priorities suddenly lose their value. And I'm like, I want to serve you because you're awesome. Not when I'm like, okay, God, I'll be over in a few minutes. I just got to fix my life first. And so as I come into the presence of God, not through my own effort, but through what Jesus has done for me, then I begin to understand what it means to come into the presence of you, God's people. And when it comes to each other, Hebrews says, let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works. You ever try to motivate anyone? A show of hands. Parents, any parents in the room? Any parents try to motivate your kids online? Try to motivate your kids. Any kids try to motivate your parents? Go on, just trying to come on guys, get it together. Anybody have a roommate leaves dirty dishes in the sink? You've tried to motivate them. You're like, I've tried everything, man. I'm a dad, and so I've tried to motivate my kids many ways over the years. I've tried to motivate them with inspirational speeches, one of my favorite ways. I'm that dad who gives inspirational speeches. Okay, kids, I got 3 quotes, I got a poem, I got a couple of sayings. You're gonna wanna post this to Instagram, get ready, I've tried to motivate my kids with dire warnings about where people who don't do certain things end up in life. Like find a serial killer and be like, I'm pretty sure they didn't clean their room either. Just gotta watch it, slippery slope. Try to motivate my kids with guilt. Anybody else try to motivate your kids with guilt? Don't you care about your dad? Anybody else? Just me, all right, liars. I've tried to motivate my kids with threats. If you ever want to see ice cream again. And let me just tell you, none of that has worked very well. The best way I have found to motivate my kids is to be around them consistently, be present in their lives on a regular basis, be more honest with them than I feel comfortable being most of the time, and then live a life in front of them that isn't perfect but is headed in the right direction. And ironically, that's the best way for us to motivate each other. You gotta be around your spiritual brothers and sisters consistently. You gotta be a little bit more honest with them than you feel comfortable being. Get real about the stuff that's going on in your lives, especially the stuff that you feel tempted to kind of hide and bury away, and then live a life in front of each other that isn't perfect but is headed in the right direction. And that's a gift that God has for us. In other words, if you put your faith in Jesus, but you're treating your life in Jesus like it's a deserted island, just you and Wilson, just you and the volleyball, just you and you are missing the other half of what God has for you. Because God has 2 gifts for you. God's presence, the presence of God's people. The pattern's clear. God's presence, the presence of God's people. I go into God's presence, I go into the presence of God's people. It's not one or the other, it's both. And the purpose of God's presence is to renew our lives every day. And the purpose of the presence of God's people is to motivate us, not through guilt or pressure or even inspirational speeches, but through encouragement and presence and honesty and listening to motivate us to acts of love and good works so we can live out our faith every day. And that's what I've experienced these past few months. What has got me through the past few months is not just me and God. It's me and God and me and God's people. It's not one or the other, it's both. In fact, can I tell you something? I don't want to just get through this season. I'm a little tired of thinking, well, let me just get through this season. I don't want to get through. I want to kick this season in the butt. Some of you are clapping and some of you are like, you're not supposed to say that in church. My mom said, you can't, you can't. I'm serious. Anybody else want to thrive? Want to come out on the other side of this stronger and better? And I'm not talking about my circumstance. I can't control my circumstances, but I can control the world inside of me by God's grace, where I press into God's presence and I press into the presence of God's people. And over the past few months, I'm just telling you, I don't know where I would be without people in my life that I've been able to get honest with, and they've got honest with me. And I've been able to be motivated by them when I felt unmotivated and discouraged, and I've been able to motivate them in return. And to do that, I had to be willing to be around God consistently, but also to be around God's people consistently, because this is how we take ground in uncertain seasons. 2 gifts, the presence of God, the presence of God's people. And that means we've got to be intentional about it. It's not going to happen by accident. Some of us are waiting for God to suck us up into his presence like we're being abducted. We're waiting for people to come to us. I'm like, we're thinking, I'm just gonna stay here at home and God's people will come. And then some of us are resentful, like, where are God's people? I thought I could count on them. Well, they're all getting together wondering why you didn't come. It's got to be intentional. We've got to make a decision to place ourselves in an environment around God's people on a regular basis. And then we've got to make a decision to practice the habit of being in God's presence, alone with God on a regular basis. This fall, you're going to need to be alone with God more than you think. You're going to need to be alone with God, and you're going to need to be together with God's people more than you think you need to be together with God's people. But if you'll embrace those two gifts, I'm telling you, you can flourish while the rest of the world is left with its head spinning. You can flourish. Presence of God, presence of God's people, and we're living this out as a church. We've been motivating each other this month through Love Month, motivating each other to acts of love and good works. We're serving people in need because Jesus said, when you serve them, you're serving me. If you want to get closer to me, Jesus says, get closer to the least of these, the people who are in need. We've been motivating each other with our vision of Journey City, a 30-mile radius of where I'm speaking right now, 1.8 million people, and we're remembering that Jesus said the biggest problem in the world today is that the harvest is great, but the workers are few. And so we'll pray and we'll go, not one or the other. We're saying, yeah, we'll lean into what God is calling us to do. We're motivating each other through our J team because we understand that as followers of Jesus, serving is not something we do. Servants, that's who we are. That's who we are. And in the process, we're keeping a priority front and center, and here it is. We've never needed these words more, and they've never held more potential than they do right now. Let us not neglect our meeting together, as some people do. I love the writer of Hebrews is like, some people, I'm not gonna name names, but there are some people who think they can put their faith in Jesus and then live on a spiritual deserted island. Don't be like them. They're not gonna flourish, they're not gonna thrive. The writer of Hebrews says, don't neglect our meeting together as some people do. Instead, encourage one another. Don't guilt trip each other, don't pressure each other. Don't just give inspirational speeches, encourage one another. Gotta be around each other consistently. Get more honest with each other than you feel comfortable getting. Live a life in front of each other that isn't perfect, but is headed in the right direction. And do that especially now that the day of his return is drawing near. The shakier the world gets, the more we lean into the presence of God and the presence of God's people. And we're standing in strength in that place in our lives. And if you're new to the whole church thing, this is why the church exists, the church that Jesus envisioned. Human beings have messed it up a lot over the years, but Jesus had a vision for a church, and he still has it. It's as strong as it's ever been, and we're trying to be that kind of church. And there are many other churches that are as well. But this is what it's all about. What Jesus envisioned was a church that would do two things: draw us closer to God and nudge us closer to each other. It's a rhythm, the presence of God, the presence of God's people, so that then we would turn around and be a light to the world. Because we're strong in those two gifts. A guy named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which is about the coolest name ever, who was a pastor in Nazi Germany in the 30s and 40s and defied Hitler, and because of it lost his life in a concentration camp, wrote these words. He said, let him who cannot be alone, anyone who doesn't know how to consistently come into the presence of God, walk right in because of what Jesus has done. Anyone who isn't comfortable being alone with God, let him beware of community. See, your relationships with other people will stay shallow if you don't understand what it means to come to God alone. And the flip side of the coin is, let him who is not in community, who doesn't know how to consistently come into the presence of God's people and do life with other people, go in the same direction, let him beware of being alone. Because eventually what happens if you're not in community is your time alone starts warping you instead of shaping you. We need both. the presence of God and the presence of God's people. So extroverts, let me ask you a question today. Are you making space in your life to be alone with God on a daily basis? If not, all the time you spend in what you may call community will eventually just become noise, superficial, a mile wide and an inch deep. And my heart's moved with compassion because for some of us who are very outgoing and we like to be around people all the time, the truth is that we sometimes use all of that noise to disguise the fact that we don't like ourselves. And we're kind of afraid to come to God alone because we're pretty sure that he wouldn't accept us. We'd have to face some things in our lives, the shadows that we never reveal when we're laughing and surrounded by people. And so we avoid the alone and try to compensate with community, but we get all jacked up in the process. And we eventually find ourselves with 1,000 acquaintances and no true friends because we never learned how to be alone. And God is saying, listen, extroverts, I want you to come to me alone. I know it may sound terrifying, but this is why we teach here one of our habits, practice a slot and spot, a time on your calendar and a place you go to read the Bible, to pray, to be alone with God, to be silent in God's presence. And extroverts, here's what I know about you. That word silent is terrifying. I don't want to be silent. But God is saying, I need you to come be alone with me. Watch this. It's not for the reason you think. God's saying, I need you to come be alone with me so that I can tell you that because of the death of my son on your behalf, you are enough all by yourself. You can come right into my presence. When you finally get alone, you'll figure out you've never been alone. So extroverts, I'm challenging you. God's given you the gift of his presence. I want you to experience it. Practice a slot and spot, time and a place, and then connect in a J group, because your friendships with people going the same direction spiritually will start to make sense when you're putting some roots down into the presence of God. Some of you have even said, well, I have lots of friends, but you don't have friends who are friends when the chips are down, who will pray with you, who won't judge you, who will listen to any secret you want to tell and encourage you. And I'm challenging you, make space for God and then make space for the presence of God's people. Introverts, let me talk to you. I know you even better. So let me just challenge you. Introverts, are you making space in your life for the presence of God's people on a consistent basis? Not just your immediate family. I think during this season, and it's not a bad thing, I've grown closer to my family during this season, especially the first few months of COVID. Our family got really close. It was a good thing. It was a healthy thing. But not just your immediate family, your spiritual family. You have brothers and sisters you have not spoken to lately. So introverts, are you making space in your life for God's people? Connect in a J group this fall. And then have grace, have reasonable standards, because you're so used to hanging out with yourself that sometimes your standards are really high. You get together with a few other people, like, this is why I don't spend time with other people. They're crazy. He's obnoxious. He's loud. She definitely should not have worn that. You're having that whole conversation in your head because you're the only person you're used to hanging out with. So you're gonna have to get some messy grace, because you will never understand the grace God shows you until you have an opportunity to show it to someone else who needs it. So introverts, connect in a J group this fall, and then practice a slot and spot, a time and place with God, because your experience with God will get more rich and meaningful when you're in community with God's people. 2 gifts, 2 things that will help you flourish in any uncertain season. Number 1 is the presence of God, because he is greater than me. That's what alone time with God reminds me. See, I think I am God sometimes. You do too. You won't admit it, but you do too. The way you try to control things. You get alone. Every day, here's what I do. Every day, the start of the day, I get alone with God. And it's like, oh yeah, I'm not God. And it's a good thing. He is greater than me. God's inviting you into his presence. And the second thing is the presence of God's people. You need time and community consistently. And there are two ways you can keep those priorities, those gifts front and center this fall. The first one is to connect in a J group. Get in a small group of people doing life together this fall. Make sure there's a time on your calendar and a place you go every week to spend time together with God's people. And the second is practice a slot and spot. Make sure there's a time on your calendar and a place you go every day to connect with God. And as you embrace those two gifts, you're gonna flourish during this season. You see how my circumstances all gonna get better? I have no idea, but you're gonna flourish during this season. You'll be like a tree planted, deep roots, wide branches, enjoying your relationship with God, regardless of the storms that come. Does that sound good to anybody? That's how I wanna live. Father, we honor you and praise you today. We come right into your presence. We just come strolling in because our confidence isn't in us. It's in Jesus Christ, whose blood has washed us clean. Come on, would you go with me right now, right into the presence of God? Bring all your sin, bring all your doubt, bring all your insecurity, bring all your frustration, bring all your disappointment, all your hopes, all your dreams, all your expectations, right into the presence of God. Come on, it's a gift. We come into your presence, God, and we thank you for the gift of this moment with you. And God, we thank you for the gift of the presence of each other. We thank you for this room. We thank you for the opportunity to gather online together, that even though we're separated by physical space, we're united. But more than that, we thank you for the opportunity to have a few people around us, closer, not just rows, but circles in our lives, where we get closer to them and in the process closer to you. God, help us embrace your presence and the presence of your people. And then even though the storms come, we'll be strong. While you let God speak to your heart for a moment more, for some of you today, you have felt that separation from God. Like there's a curtain, there's a wall, there's a locked door between you and God. And maybe you've thought, well, the only way I could ever get to God is to be a religious person or to try harder or to live a better life or do more good deeds. But the truth is, none of that will unlock the door. None of that will kick down the wall. None of that will pull aside the curtain. The good news is Jesus has opened the door for you. And through his death on the cross, he's inviting you into a real relationship with God. And if you want that, you don't have to wait a moment more. The separation that you felt between you and God melts away in the moment you put all of your trust, 100% of your confidence in Jesus, him alone. And you can do that right now. So watching online, here in the room, if that's you, I'm gonna lead us in prayer. And this is your opportunity. With faith in your heart, whisper out a prayer to God. You can use these words if it helps you, but pray with faith. Make this your moment with God. Jesus, today I believe in you. You are the Son of God who died for me. Because you died, I can live. My sins are forgiven, and I receive that right now. I'm yours. I'm gonna follow you. And if that's you, while everyone around you is still focused on God, if you're here in the room, if you would say, that's my prayer, I'm taking that step today, will you lift your hand, just hold it up, boldly saying, my faith is in Jesus, yes. Yeah, my faith is in Jesus today. If you're watching online, type the word faith in the comments right now. It's a simple step, but just let us know that you're taking this step, making this move, putting your faith in Jesus. And then all of us, can we celebrate the goodness of God together? Would you do that with me?